let's continue with our next session. And welcome to the stage, Caroline Westbrook, Test Development Researcher at the British Council.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. Let's welcome as well Riza Tasviri. Riza Tasviri, I was Senior Team Leader and Research Leader at IDP. And they are going to present a research that they also carried out with the help of Tony Clark, Senior Research Manager at Cambridge Assessment English, and Richard Spivey, Test Development Researcher at the Assessment Research Group of the British Council. So welcome, Caroline and Riza, and whenever you want.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at incorporating mediation descriptors into rating criteria for an integrated writing assessment. As you just heard, this was carried out with a group of us, myself and my colleague Richard Spivey from the British Council, and Tony Clark from Cambridge Assessment, and Riza, who's here as well. Okay, so what are we going to be looking at? We're going to talk to you about an integrated task, well, a prototype integrated task that we worked on, and we'll talk to you about the rationale for that project and the task design. We'll then explain how we introduced the new CV mediation descriptors into an existing rating scale that we had. Then we'll talk about the rater training that we did, and then we'll talk you through the actual project trialing and how we collected data from raters and the implications of the project. So, excuse me, the rationale behind developing this prototype integrated tasks, well, these prototype integrated tasks, was the need to really kind of explore what the contemporary EAP situation is. So what is a contemporary EAP task design, and how can we reflect the academic domain based on the research that we know is out there? So we did an extensive literature review, and on top of that, we also brought in the project team's experience of teaching, working at universities, examining for IELTS, and the fact that 2 of the project team members had done their PhDs based on IELTS and integrated academic writing. So as you can probably tell from these slides, this was done with the existing IELTS test in mind, but with future possible changes to the IELTS test as a kind of reasoning behind the project. So you'll see later on that we've actually adapted the IELTS rating criteria, and that was the rating scale that was used. The other point that was the rationale is that we recognise that writing is arguably the most essential academic skill. But as I say, we wanted to really focus on contemporary EAP task design and investigate whether actually the current test design is the best. So, taking you back in history, first of all, when the changes from the IELTS revision project were introduced in 1995, the integrated reading into writing task that was previously present in the ELTS test back then was dropped in favour of discrete writing tasks. This was really due to concerns around the construct validation of integrated writing tasks at the time. But in the meantime, a lot more work has been done, a lot more research has looked at integrated tasks and the nature of integrated academic writing. And so we know a lot more about what is involved and the cognitive processes involved now. Also, because a lot of work has looked at this in the meantime, we know that several researchers have actually questioned the authenticity and the validity of an independent impromptu writing task, such as we have in the IELTS writing task 2. And this is because much university writing has been found to be based on writing from sources, and therefore independent writing tasks have been criticised for falling short of tapping into the academic writing construct, as we see there from Gabriel 2009. So what do we mean by an integrated task? What is an integrated task? Well, Knoch and Sitajalabhorn 2013 state that for a task to be considered an integrated task, a significant proportion of language should be provided as input, and the language contained in this source text should be used and transformed to complete the writing task. Weigel 2002 also argues that university writing is virtually always based on some prior reading, if not also listening and speaking, and in almost all cases must refer to written sources. So I'll now talk to you about the task design. So what we have here, the boxes in blue, with the blue outline, are the integrated task that we designed. The boxes in green are a new independent task that we designed, and the boxes in red are the different analyses that we carried out. So for the integrated task, we analysed 4 different areas. This was source text use analysis, scoring analysis, we collected data from focus groups and questionnaires, and we also did a linguistic analysis. Now, the task itself, as you can see, involved reading input and listening input, and those two fed into an academic essay which incorporated ideas from both of the input tasks. The reading input was about 600 words, and students had about 12 minutes to take notes on the content, and then they didn't see the reading input after that. For the listening input, this was about 450 words. This part lasted about 10 minutes because it was played twice, and students had the opportunity to take notes throughout. They then used the notes that they'd taken to write an academic essay incorporating ideas, as I say, from both texts, and the requirements were that they should write at least 250 words in 40 minutes. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the independent task, we're not focusing on that one today, but just to give you an idea of what we did. This was an email based on an academic scenario, and test takers were expected to write 150 words in 20 minutes. We then analysed this task for the scoring data. Again, we collected focus group and questionnaire data, and we looked at the linguistic analysis to see if it was actually resulting in the kind of language that we were hoping it would. So when we came to designing the tasks, as I mentioned, we took into account the literature, but also we took into account the rating scales, and we looked at the literature around rating scales as well. So in line with Chan, Inouye and Taylor 2015, who point out that rating scales must also take into account the features of the task, we amended the rating scales for both tasks. So for the integrated task, Knoch and Sitajalabhorn, again 2013, advocate including descriptors which measure test takers' ability to mine, select, organize and collect ideas in the written product, because they argue that these processes are necessary when accounting for skill integration. Gabriel and Placans 2014 also highlight the fact that scoring rubrics for integrated tasks should have progressively different descriptors. So that isn't a typo, it says that, but what they mean is they should be they should notice or highlight the different levels of difficulty as they go up through the levels. Starting at the lower levels, which would address the mechanics of source use, and moving on to the higher levels where we would be addressing the quality of source use. So with these insights from the literature in mind, we consulted the mediation descriptors from the recently published CEFR companion volume from the Council of Europe 2020, and we made some amendments to the IELTS scale. And I'll now hand over to Reza to talk you through that part.
Thanks, Caroline. Now, our general approach to devising the scales for the prototype tasks was iterative in nature and cyclical. Iterative in the sense that there were a few iterations of the production of scales and refining the scales, and cyclical in the sense that there were movements between task design and scales development, skill refinement, and then feeding back to task design, and this was repeated a few times. The other feature of the approach that we took was that our approach to designing of scales was multi-sourced. Unlike more classical approaches to scales development, where the so-called armchair approach is used, where there is only expert judgment used for developing these scales, we drew on a number of different sources. Carolyn previously referred to the theoretical considerations and the theoretical framework that was in place, and also the literature in the scale about the scales. We used the existing IELTS scales as another source. We also looked at the target languages domain. We also looked at standard frameworks, existing standard frameworks of the CEFR, and we used performance samples to refine the scales, and also we used rater feedback and cognition to refine the scales further. And these, on the if you look under the stages, you will see the different iterations of this process. We first did construct mapping based on the task, and also looking at the CEFR, and then we aligned the constructs with the CEFR band descriptors. An initial drafting of the scales was done, which was further refined by using some expert advice. Then a few minor iterations of refining the scales until we got to the point of trialing the scales. And then the raters were trained to use their scales, and as a final step, which can of course be ongoing, was using the scores from the trial to do further validation. Now, the skills that we developed, as I said, were based on the existing IELTS band descriptors or scales. So the criteria, there are 4 different criteria. The criteria of task response, that's where mediation band descriptors were introduced into the existing scales and further adjustments made. The second criterion is the coherence and cohesion, which looks at the structural and organizational aspects of of performances. And then the 2 remaining criteria are tied with the use of language, and we use the indicator of adaptive language from the CEFR scales. Now, focusing on the first criterion, which is a task response, and that's where mediation was introduced. Here are the key indicators within the CEFR scales that we identified, and then we brought into the scales that we were developing: processing text in writing, note-taking, and summarizing the text as the 3 major overarching key indicators of mediation. And when we talk about summarizing, what do we mean by it? These keywords would highlight what we were looking at and the kind of skills or sub-skills that we were tapping into to operationalize in the scales. Summarizing is to express the most important facts or ideas about something or someone in a short and clear form. And the ideas and facts are from the source material. Paraphrasing, which is using the language to repeat something written or spoken using different words in a simple and shorter form, the original meaning to make the original meaning clear, and then comparison and contrast. which is comparing and contrasting, as the name suggests, involving identifying the similarities and differences between the two concepts. Now, Carolyn previously made a reference to how the scales would progressively become more difficult in order to capture performance at different levels. Here, the screenshot will give you just an example of how the key indicators were written up in the scales at a uh, at a at one of the lower bands of the scales, which is band 5. Now, moving on to some of the other key indicators of mediation that were operationalized and integrated into the scales, we've got synthesizing, and the indicators that I have on this slide were integrated more in the higher end of the scale. So synthesizing denotes putting separate facts and bringing different ideas together to form a single piece of work, evaluating and commenting on the information that has been mediated into the performance, and reconstructing arguments or accounts, which is combining a lot of information in order to get a complete description of what happened. And the snapshot gives you an example of well, it shows you the wording of the scales at a higher end of the band scales, which is band 8. And of course, on top of mediation, there were some other indicators that we had in the scales, and these indicators would tap into features that are not necessarily captured via the lens of mediation. For example, the use of inaccurate material, or introducing a personal opinion, or having focus and precision in explanations, in expansions, and things like that. So elaboration and extension, repetition, the main ideas as something that would be assessed in the performances, and also the relevance of ideas and expansions. Now, I refer to the two criteria of LR and GRA, and these are the scales. These are the criteria for assessing language use in the text, in the performances by the test takers. Now, given that there is use of language from the source material, that language is then transferred by the test taker into the test performance, and to capture that, we use the descriptors for adapting language from the CFR scales, and these are the main features or the key indicators of adapting language. Simply borrowing or copying and repeating at lower end of the scales, paraphrasing in the mid to higher band of the scales, interpret and explain, and then adapt varied language from the input material and appropriate it, take ownership of the language, and also reproduce, register. And the colored scheme shows you examples of the exact wording and the scaling of these indicators in the band descriptors. As an example, I will only read band 6. For example, at band 6, you would expect to see the candidate or the test taker is able to use and adapt language from input material, and that ability is evident, but it comes with some awkwardness in paraphrasing. And, well, of course, that pans out across the other scales. Now, after the initial drafting of the scales, we went into a few iterations of refining the scales. At one stage, we had the scales tried by a small number of very expert raters whom we interviewed later on, and whose input we took into further refining the scales until we had a final draft. Now, to use the final draft for the phase B trial of the band descriptors, which was the real trial of the band descriptors by examiners, we did train the examiners to be able to use them, and we did it in different stages. The first stage that we did was we put together a pack which contained different sorts of information. It familiarized the raters with the theoretical underpinning and the rationale of the task design. Then there was an explanation of the constructs that the prototype test operationalizes, and then they were introduced into the scales themselves. Following that, an online session for just short of 4 hours was run with the examiners, with the raters, and in the online session, as well as being again given the information about the rationale behind the test design, the examiners were now able to practice with applying the scales, and then to um, to calibrate themselves against rating or scoring that was done by expert raters. And in the last step of familiarization and training, the examiners were asked to actually test themselves using the scales to set the standards. And then they were ready to apply the scales. I'll hand
Okay,
now to Tony.
thanks, Reza. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
all good.
So Carolyn's told us about the task that we made. Reza's told us about the rater training. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what happened next. So these tasks were part of a larger trial. It's a very big trial, as you can see from the details there. 13 countries involved, hundreds of students. We really wanted to put these tasks through their paces. And to do so, these were the research questions we formed. The first one, how did our 2 writing tasks perform in the trial? And for that, we were thinking about scoring data and all manner of other aspects like that. Second of all, perceptions were really important to us. So how were the tasks perceived by participants? And I'm meaning examiners, test takers, and we also included some EAP experts to give us some views as well. In terms of data collection, so Reza mentioned we had some rater training for writing using these adjusted assessment scales with the mediation descriptors. We got a lot of test takers for writing. In this case, we got 237 test takers. They did both tasks. As Carolyn mentioned, we're focusing on the integrated task today. We had focus groups, so 6 focus groups, a whole range of different backgrounds of IELTS examiners from seniority levels up and down. We had experts come in, 4 focus groups, and then we held focus groups with students as well, or candidates, to see what they thought of the test, what was their experience. And everyone involved was surveyed too. So we got 20 examiners surveyed, and all of those test takers, 237. We really wanted to find out how did these tests perform and what did people think of them. Okay, so overall, we can say the test did pretty well. Based on the surveys, the focus group, the scoring data, we would say these are psychometrically robust tasks. The examiners were generally able to implement the new skills with accuracy and reliably. The levels were appropriate in relation to the IELTS candidature we had in mind. So when we asked examiners about that, the vast majority of them, or the majority of them, 83%, said, yeah, this is about the right level for the candidates we examined. A lot of people considered these to be authentic and relevant tasks. So I'm talking about educators and also students as well. 91% of students said these tasks look like academic tasks. They look like tasks that could help us on an academic journey. And then finally, examiners and item writers, they thought this was feasible. So if we were to include this in a large-scale test such as IELTS, that might be possible, which is very encouraging. And then finally, what would need to be done if we want to take this further? Well, there's considerable work still to be done. We need to look at source text use. That was something that proved a little bit more complicated than we had imagined. It's a complex thing. What do learners or candidates do with the source text they're given? Some kind of automated software would be really helpful there. We're thinking Turnitin, for example, the plagiarism software. We want to continue with our data analysis, more source text use, for example, and analysis around that. What does this mean for task design? How are candidates using the tasks and the source text? How are examiners interpreting the kind of criteria that Reza was talking you through? More analysis needed. Based on that analysis, we want to further refine our rating criteria. They're not the finished article by any means. That's what the process is. It's developmental and cyclical. And we know what we want to do next. Further than that, we want more trialing. We want small-scale trialing, different prompts used. So the writing tasks we showed you were based on a small sample of prompts. We need to see how that worked with a wider range. We want more rater training, as I mentioned, 4 hours. We need more than that. That was purely for trialing purposes. We want to take it further. We want to see not just what kind of training we can do, but what's the impact of the training. What does it mean for examiners and scoring? Also, a practical note, we need to probably reduce the number of test versions that examiners had to mark. 89% of them said it's quite difficult to mark these because you've got source texts, you've got other things to think about, listening, reading, input. That would probably become easier with familiarity, like everything, but it's quite a high number there. And lastly, we'd want to explore the impact of test preparation. I'm very interested, we all are, in what would happen if you prepared candidates for tasks like this. I think it would have quite a big impact, not just on scoring, but also perceptions as well. So overall, the task performed pretty well. If you want to read further, there's some references, and we're happy to answer any questions if there's time. Thank you for your attention.
Right. Well, thank you very much, you all. We still have time for one question, and we have that question here. It is from Beverly Baker, and she says, "Thanks very much for this. There has been some work using the concept of mediation from the CEFR to introduce plurilingual approach to assessment. For example, having multilingual source documents for the creation of an integrated task in a target language. I'm wondering if at IELTS you've been having any discussions about this."
Good question. Who'd like to answer it? Caroline?
I was going to say you should probably answer it because plurilingualism is one of Nick's favourite subjects. So have you had any of those discussions at Cambridge?
Sure. Thanks, Beba. It's a good question. I think there's so much in the current project that we've been talking about with mediation and incorporating these descriptors. Bringing in a plurilingual approach to assessment is definitely something we would discuss and is of interest, not just to IELTS, but every serious major text provider, if that happens to be the route that assessment goes down. I think for the purposes of this project and today, we had to focus on English, really. We've got our work cut out as it is, trying to bring in all these different forms and the new mediation descriptors. So to answer your question, it's a really interesting point. There are discussions ongoing, not just in Cambridge, but all around the place. But for the purposes of this specific task, English is probably enough for the moment. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
No, I would be tempted to agree at this point. It's certainly an interesting area that we could look at going forward. But at the moment, I think we're just sort of basically looking at, you know, the sort of standard integration of English input into an English output.
Thanks, though.
Good
Right.
question,
Well, sorry.
I was just going to say thank you, Beverly. It's a good question.
Yes, it is. Okay, well, I wouldn't like to finish without reading one question from another one of our speakers, Lynn May. She asks, well, she says, "Thank you for sharing this important initiative. I wondered if the same movement towards integrated tasks is happening with speaking too."
Yes, and I think one of our colleagues is presenting on it. We've been looking at some integrated speaking tasks as well. I'm saying one of our colleagues is presenting on it. There is a presentation, I believe it's by Cheryl, on comprehensibility. But the last I heard, Cheryl was ill. So we may want to just check whether she's presenting or whether one of her co-presenters are presenting. But that looks at an integrated speaking test that we worked on as well.
I don't know if any of you want to add anything. No? All right. Well, so
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but we need to finish the session now. We don't have more time for questions. Anyway, they are there in the chat. They are there in the chat. So maybe if we have the time, you can try talk with the participants. But well, anyway, you can also read many comments thanking you for this interesting presentation. I thank you too, as well as, well, I thank you all, of course. So thank you so much for being here. And you all, please, the audience, let's meet here in 4 minutes for the next presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I see Charles next. Good.